Welcome to the Secret Underground Laboratory Recovery and Salvage, where rude mechanicals do magic. Hello, I'm Bronze Age, Director of the Secret Underground Laboratory Recovery and Salvage. And today I'm going to use a new technique for putting US standard sockets on this candelier. I call it a candelier because it was constructed without electric lights in mind. It's intended to have a big candle stabbed down on this spike, and when they came time for someone to wire it, they used these European style sockets which are built into the candle covers, and then the connection between the socket and the power wire was just twisted wires and tape, and that's just not good. We're not going to have that kind of thing around here. Now, the construction of the chandelier itself is fairly interesting. Everything on here is hammer welded. And what that means is a blacksmith actually got all the metal pieces up to basically white hot, and then slammed them together and hit them with a hammer until they became one piece. All these joints here, up here at the top, are hammer welded on a blacksmith's anvil. All these pieces are bent and created on a blacksmith's anvil. Now, what that means is that dating it kind of difficult, because the technology of hammer welding iron has not really changed much for probably about 800,000 years or so. So if you wanted to say definitely how old this was, you'd have to have some sort of chemical analysis of the actual metal, determine if it was steel or iron or whatever, and it might give you some idea of when it was made, but I'm not really sure that's all that important. What is important is that it looks nice, the customer wants it in their house. But whether it's 300 years old or made in somebody's basement last summer, it really doesn't matter. The problem is I've got this kind of light socket here, and I need to put this one in its place. I'm going to pull this up. We see, well, we've got more of our taped connections. The bobiche comes up through here, and you notice the wire runs up along here, pinch between this metal and this wooden part. Another less than ideal practice. And I need to put that on there. The problem I have, this socket has to go away, and this one has to be put in its place. Now, the threads in here fit this particular kind of pipe, which is known as 1/8 inch iron pipe. If you go and you measure this, there's nowhere you're going to find anywhere that's 1/8. What this is a fossil of the Industrial Revolution. Back in the days when houses were lit with gas lights, this size of thread was the smallest there was, and the gas would flow through it through the wall to your windows, your wall sconces and stuff like that. And when they started converting lights over to electric, they continued to use this thread, although the hole in the pipe is a little bit bigger. If you take any lamp apart made in the past 100 years, you're going to find 1/8 inch iron pipe inside of it. That's just the way it's made, the way it's always been. So what I've got to do is figure out a way to get this pipe onto here so that the socket can go on like that. Now, I could weld this pipe to the spike here, but that would create several problems of its own, mainly that I'd have to do a lot of grinding and cleaning up here to get the bobiche back down on it. And I think there's a much simpler and probably a little bit more elegant solution, which is to cut screw threads on this spike and then screw threads inside this pipe so that this pipe will simply screw down on top of here, and then I'll be able to fasten everything back together and start rewiring it. This is a tool called a die. It's made of very hard steel, and it's got these cutting teeth in it, which are used to cut threads on a steel rod. And this is not perfectly round, but it should serve our purposes. A little handle here to turn it, and then I just have to start the tedious work of doing machine work by hand. Kind of a contradiction in terms. And there we are. We've got our threads cut. All we need to do is cut the corresponding threads inside the pipe, and we'll be ready to wire this thing up with only 11 more to do. Now, there is no easy way to cut the threads on the inside of this pipe. First problem comes up is it's very difficult to clamp this without damaging the threads, and I'm going to need them later on. So this calls for a shop-made tool. Starts with using one of these brass couplers that's threaded with the 1/8 inch iron pipe threads all the way through. Then I saw it in half. And I can take this and clamp it in here. And that will squeeze it pretty tight. So it allows me to use another cutting tool, which will go in here and cut the threads so we can put our chandelier back together. And that's as far as this tap is going to go. The back and forth motion is to break the chips. These little cutting teeth, as they're going around inside that pipe, they're stripping off a little curl of steel. And if you're not careful, they can build up and you could actually damage the pipe or break the tap. Probably wouldn't happen on something this lightweight, but it's just a habit I've gotten into of going forward, cutting, coming back, breaking it off. These taps aren't exorbitantly expensive, but there's no sense in breaking one when you don't have to. And if you're working on something really important, more important than a little short piece of pipe, breaking a tap off in something that you need to use later really makes a lot of work for somebody. I always use the blue thread lock whenever I'm assembling a chandelier or lamp, and these shop-made threads are kind of rough, so they don't go as smooth as a factory nut and bolt would, but it's still good insurance against this thing coming loose when somebody goes to change a light bulb or something like that. And my little brass pipe clamp here is also useful for installing it, because I won't have to booger up the threads with the pliers, running this thing all the way down. There's a little plastic spigot, that's a technical term, that is nailed on here that holds this sheet metal crown to the wooden base, and it was used to hold the candlestick socket combination in place. What I've got to do is drill a hole here that's off center, and then also ream out this center hole so that it'll fit down over the pipe. And this is the problem I've always faced many times in working on chandeliers. This very thin sheet metal, it's very difficult to drill a good clean hole through because these edges of the drill bit, the cutting points, they catch the sheet metal and it's so lightweight that it just snarls it up, curls it up, and then suddenly pulls it up into the drill bit. And there is just simply no safe way to hold a small piece of sheet metal when it's being caught by a drill bit. I've always come up with all kinds of different clamps, presses, things like that to hold it down. And even if I can keep it in one place while I'm drilling a hole through it, it always ends up distorting the sheet metal and I have to deal with that problem. But I have learned a new technique for drilling in thin sheet metal thanks to Mark Presling, who has a YouTube channel named Mark Presling. He works out of Australia where he has his machine shop. Now I'm going to just hold this in this hole with this air conditioned filter material so I don't have to worry about trying to hang on to these sharp points. What Mark said to do was take a piece of cloth, ordinary cloth here, fold it over 4 times and put it under your drill bit. I do have to say that is a nice clean cut and a piece of very thin brass. So thanks, Mark. I really appreciate it. And now back at the bench, we can see what our chandelier is going to look like. Always put a nut on the pipe underneath the socket because that gives you a nice square and straight platform for these rather thin little delicate threads to seat on. If you've got something like a cast surface, something rough, and you tighten it down, they're going to distort and bend and won't actually be tight, just sort of like jammed into place. If somebody goes to change a light bulb or something like that, then the whole thing could come loose. And with that blue thread sealer on there, I can just give it a nice little hand tighten. And when the sealer cures, this will be nice and tight. I won't have to worry about it ever coming loose. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the wiring of the chandelier because on chandeliers where the wires run across the arms like this on the surface, it's just a matter of aesthetics, getting it down nice and neat, tied in the right places so the wires all lay nice and flat and don't distract from the chandelier. However, on a 12 light chandelier, and especially one with as lightweight as this is, there's a lot of splices. And there's a variety of ways that you can deal with that because they get pretty big and clunky. On this one, the original people who wired it, they have this little square mechanical connector. I find this real common on European chandeliers. And then you also have the tape splice, which I'm pretty sure there's no solder or anything under here. They just twisted the wires together and they taped it together, then painted over it. And we're going to use a technique on this that different and also reduces the number of splices that you need. Now this is the power cord, which is going to come from the ceiling. It's routed through the chain. And the most straightforward way to do this would be to run this cord all the way down to the bottom where the sockets are, run a wire from each socket and splice it in, which would be pretty ugly because you'd have 12 wires bundled into one, no way to get that to lay flat, just going to be a big bulge and not very attractive. So what we're going to start with is the big wire and 3 smaller wires that are going to go down the chains down to the rings where the light sockets are. Now the splice is going to be protected by shrink tubing, a special kind of plastic which draws up when it gets hot. And that needs to be put on before I make the connection. Now I gather up all these wires and twist them together very tightly. And then I take the main power wire and wrap it around, trying to get it wrapped around it like a coil spring with the loops fairly tight to each other. Working up in here, not really that easy, trying to get my fingers in between these leaves, but that's what I need to make a neat looking splice. And the Secret Underground Laboratory, every splice is soldered. There is absolutely no place for wire nuts, or even worse, just leaving the wires twisted like this. And I get a good coating of solder, getting the wires hot enough so that the solder flows all the way through, loading it up and holding it there long enough to make sure that all four of these individual wires are now stuck together. Now after it cools, I feel it to make sure that there's no sharp points or little barbs sticking out, because that's always possible. And I push the shrink wrap down about there with my little mini torch, lightly heated up, holding back far enough that I don't actually start to melt the insulation, but it will draw down nice and tight, and that forms a very good protective coating. No chance of anybody reaching up here, getting shocked or whatever. Now with the splices made at the top, we've got 3 wires coming down, one on each suspension chain, down to the bands where the sockets are. The wire comes down each chain, is tucked around behind the band here, and comes out on the arm. Now you'll notice we've got this nice brass wire. Every point along here has got it held down nice and tight, so it's not going to be flopping around or distract from the rest of the chandelier. Now the wire from the arm runs along the top of the band here, comes up through the bobiche, and it's ready to be put on the socket. But you'll notice there's also another wire here. Now, it gets complicated when you try to explain it, but it's actually quite simple. Is that we simply twist these 2 wires together, and the splice that we would have somewhere on the outside will be right here hidden underneath the candle cover. Now there are 2 points that are critical to this kind of wiring. First is all duplex wiring that's made for lamps and lighting has a smooth side and a ridged side. You can feel them with your fingers, and that's how you can tell which wire is which when you're at the other end. And in here I've got both smooth wires twisted together and both ridged wires twisted together. Now this one is going to go on down. It will go over to the next socket on the line, which is this one, and another wire comes out of it, and it comes down and comes into this one, which also has 2 wires. That comes out, runs all the way back around to this one right here, which is the last on the line. And that way we get to our 4 sockets with just 1 wire coming down the arm and no splices to be seen anywhere. We do this 2 more times for the other 3, and this chandelier will be ready to go. Now the last critical element is where these wires are connected on the socket. Is that according to National Electrical Code, you have to have the stranded wires under a screw terminal must be tinned. Now what that means is that you have a little drop of solder on the end so these wires don't splay out when you put it under the screw terminal. There's no substitute for doing that. Now we have two colored screws on here, silver screw and a brass colored screw. The wires with the ridges always go on the silver colored screw. You tuck it down behind the screw in a clockwise fashion so that when you tighten it down, it will draw the wire under the screw instead of out of it. Now I just have to go around the chandelier 11 more times and this job will basically be finished. Well, this is Bronze Age for the Secret Underground Laboratory Recovery and Salvage. Thanking you for sitting through this video for this quite nice chandelier. I would appreciate it if you would hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope to see you again next week in another video. Again, thank you.